Africa in an Age of Transition. The objectives are 1. Explain how European expansion affected Africa with the dramatic increase of the slave trade. And 2, characterize the traditional political systems and cultures that continued to exist in most of Africa. Now, the slave trade in Africa had existed long before Europe had really moved into the region. However, with the new market that Europe finds in Africa, we see a dramatic expansion. So traffic in slaves was not new by any means. It was not new in Africa, and it certainly was not new globally, of course. But the primary market for African slaves was Southwest Asia early on, coming from the eastern coast of Africa across the Indian Ocean, and of course domestic slavery as well. Most slaves were used as domestic servants in general. And so we see this trend existing, usually as a result of some kind of conflict or war. But by the 15th century, you have somewhere around 1,000 slaves brought to Portugal a year. And so by the 1400s, Europe had found a new source of labor and affordable labor for them. But inevitably what we're going to see with the initial development of colonies throughout the globe, and particularly in the New World, and especially the boom of sugarcane production that we're going to see in the Caribbean, namely the West Indies, as it was called, we're going to see the increase of slavery due to the ease and availability of labor through that method. So cane sugar was introduced to Europe from Southwest Asia during the Middle Ages, and Europe began to have quite a sweet tooth. And during the 16th century, the 1500s, plantations were set up along the coast of Brazil and on the islands in the Caribbean to grow sugarcane. And in fact, the warm and humid climate was ideal for the growing of sugarcane. And so the sugarcane really takes hold of that region. We see a dramatic transformation of the ecology and the environment in general in the Caribbean as indigenous peoples, plants, and animals are eradicated, and we see the boom of planting cane sugar everywhere, all over the Caribbean islands and Brazil, and the importing of a new labor force to work these cane sugar fields. And so largely this is a very heavy manual job where cane sugars has to be cut down and stripped, and through a complicated process of heavy labor is transformed into what was put into tea and inevitably coffee, as we'll see. So this was really an engine that drove a lot of the slave trade. It was in 1518 that a Spanish ship carried the first boatload of African slaves from Africa to the Americas, initiating what became known as the triangular trade model, the triangular trade idea. That is, that Europeans would bring down guns and other goods to be traded in Africa for slaves. It's a myth to think that the Europeans made deep incursions into Africa to conquer the people, to kidnap people, and bring them into slavery. No, the African slave markets that existed there were happy to sell slaves to the Europeans, particularly people with a very greedy eye toward what one might do with these European weapons. And so notorious kings and entrepreneurs on some level were really ambitious toward pawning off and selling off slaves to the Europeans. Not that the Europeans are innocent in all of this, but they found a willing market there and would bring guns down there and pots and other things and would trade for the slaves. The slaves would be transported from Africa to the Caribbean and Brazil, and then they would be exchanged for gold or perhaps sugar itself or molasses, and that would be brought back to the European continent, where they would be again traded for weapons or something else to be brought back to Africa. So it became a cycle, not so circular but triangular, hence triangular trade. Now, European merchant ships, like I said, carried guns and clothes to Africa and traded for slaves, and trade for tobacco, molasses, sugar, raw cotton. All of those ended up being huge commodities that the slaves were used to produce and were used to trade them for, and those are the goods that would be in hot demand in the European continent. Now, here's an infographic of the numbers of slaves coming out of Africa and the destination to which they're going. So we can see that most of the slaves are coming from West Central Africa, and some from Benin and the Gold Coast in general. But to the south, you see the Slave Coast there. And the bulk of these slaves are going to Brazil and to the Caribbean. You notice that a smaller portion, in fact, a quite tiny portion relative to the whole, is going to North America. It's interesting that North American slavery is remembered the most, probably because it lasted the longest, but initial slavery in quantities is really going to Brazil and to the Caribbean. And that's true for one central reason, because those people were worked to death constantly. That they were worked to death, and the treatment of them, of these people, was quite brutal, and they had very minimal life expectancy. And so rather than weaken or lessen the working conditions, to improve the working conditions or lessen the workload, they thought that it would be cheaper just to buy new slaves every year. So that was kind of the trend that it began to emerge. Now, as many as 10 million African slaves were brought to the Americas between the early 16th and late 19th centuries. A huge movement of peoples shuffled throughout the world, which is itself part of the Columbian Exchange. And you see the journey of slaves from Africa to the Americas as a quite brutal affair that became known as the Middle Passage, that is, the middle portion of the triangular trade route, where these people are treated as cargo, laying down in the cargo hold quite brutally. And the death rate was high, disease was high. But this was treated like any other cargo, and the cargo would be disposed of that was sick or bad or rotten. And it was seen as part of the cost of doing business. Now, the sources of slaves. Most slaves in Africa were prisoners of war. That tends to be the general idea. This is a long, ancient tradition of warfare, war occurring in a region, and instead of killing the captives, killing those who lost the battle, their lives were then forfeit and served their masters, served those who were victorious. Now, this system becomes quite a different affair when Europe is taking these African slaves from Africa and to a different working condition, a foreign world. So while Africans had always been enslaved in Africa to some extent, enslaved by other Africans, largely as a result of warfare, here we're seeing a completely different beast emerge, where the slaves are not treated necessarily as prisoners of war anymore, but more as a good or commodity. So Europeans bought them from local African merchants at slave markets for gold or guns and so forth. treated as a local good, a local commodity, just like a gun or like sugarcane. So local merchants ignored the depopulation that inevitably began to occur in coastal regions and continued to sell slaves. Why? Because the money was good. And we see this trend across history, that people ignore the issues that are existing within their society to make a bit of coin. And so this tends to be the truth on the coastal societies as we see a dramatic decrease in population. So what were the effects of the slave trade in general in Africa? We see the slave trade led to a depopulation of some areas. That's certainly true. And it deprived many African communities of the youngest and strongest men and women. So you lose a generation, several generations. And it, of course, leads to stagnation of development and growth in Africa. And so this is, of course, a burden that has to be borne by Europeans for their portion. But really, this is a byproduct of, again, a currency-driven, greed-driven, wealthy elite who want to make money off of other people. This tends to be something that has always existed and perhaps will always exist. And so the growth of Africa in general on the coastline was, in a certain sense, brought to stagnation because of this economic model, not just on the European side, but on the African side as well. So the slave trade had devastating effects on numerous African states, particularly Benin in West Africa was an advanced civilization, but it was wiped out by gradual depopulation from slavery, largely responsible between Benin and the European interests. So while you do have parties on both sides that are guilty of this great sin, I might say, the idea that it is solely borne on the Europeans is anachronistic. It's certainly wrong. This is the product of a complicated economic model and system that exploited people for economic benefit on both sides. And so our objectives were, one, explain how European expansion affected Africa with the dramatic increase of the slave trade, and second, characterize the traditional political systems and cultures that continue to exist in most of Africa.